The Wyoming wind carried more than dust that October morning when Samuel Webb found them huddled behind the hay bales in his barn. 3 children, no older than 10, dirty and shivering. The boy, rail-thin with hollow eyes, had his arms wrapped around twin girls who couldn't stop trembling. Samuel's first instinct was to call social services. His second was to offer them breakfast. But when he stepped closer, the boy didn't run. Instead, he pressed himself against his sisters like a human shield, whispering, "Please don't hurt them. Hurt me instead." Those words hit Samuel like a freight train. 20 years ago, he'd said the exact same thing to his own father, before he found God, before he escaped to this ranch, before he buried the truth about why he really left Salt Lake City. Samuel Webb wasn't just a rancher. He was a survivor who'd spent decades hiding from a past that looked exactly like what he was seeing in this barn. Samuel raised his hand slowly, the way he would approach a spooked horse. "Easy now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt anyone." The boy's grip on his sisters tightened. Up close, Samuel could see the defensive tension in the child's narrow shoulders, the way his eyes darted between Samuel's face and hands, cataloguing potential threats. The twins, identical girls with matted blonde hair, hadn't made a sound, but their eyes were wide with the kind of fear that comes from experience, not imagination. "My name's Samuel Webb. This is my ranch." He crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. "What are your names?" The boy's jaw worked silently for a moment before he spoke. "I'm Lucas. These are Emma and Ellie." His voice carried an adult weight that no 10-year-old should possess. "We're not stealing anything. We were just cold." "I can see that." Samuel noticed the threadbare jackets, the shoes with holes that let in more than just cold air. "How long have you been traveling?" 2 days, maybe 3. Lucas's eyes never left Samuel's face. "We'll leave if you want. Just give us a minute to get ready." Something in the boy's tone made Samuel's chest tighten. There was no defiance there, no anger, just a weary acceptance that spoke of doors slammed in faces, of adult hands raised in warning or worse. Samuel recognized that exhaustion. He'd carried it himself once, along with bruises that his father had been careful to keep hidden under clothing. "Where's home?" Samuel asked gently. "Nowhere." The answer came too quickly, too practiced. Lucas shifted slightly, and Samuel caught a glimpse of angry red marks around the boy's wrists before the sleeves covered them again. "We're fine on our own." The twins still hadn't spoken, but Samuel noticed how they watched Lucas for cues, how they seemed to shrink whenever Samuel moved. These weren't just scared children, they were traumatized ones. And Lucas wasn't just their brother, he was their protector, their shield against whatever they'd left behind. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities. Runaways from an abusive home seemed most likely, but something nagged at him. The children were too clean for street kids, their clothes too new despite the wear. The twins' hair was neatly braided, their faces scrubbed. Someone had been caring for them recently. "When did you last eat?" Samuel asked. Lucas hesitated, and Samuel saw him calculating, weighing hunger against safety, need against suspicion. "Yesterday morning, maybe." "Well, I was just about to make some pancakes." Samuel stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "My wife's visiting her sister in town, so I've got more food than I can eat by myself. You'd be doing me a favor." "We don't take charity," Lucas said quickly. "Not charity. Payment." Samuel gestured toward the barn. "I could use help mucking out the stalls. Fair trade, breakfast for work. Deal?" For the first time, Lucas seemed uncertain. Samuel could practically see the internal debate playing out across the boy's face, the desperate hunger warring with ingrained caution. Finally, Lucas nodded once, sharp and decisive. "But if anyone comes looking," Lucas said, "we were never here." The word sent a chill down Samuel's spine that had nothing to do with the October morning. Someone was looking for these children, someone they were running from, and judging by the fear in their eyes, it wasn't a social worker or concerned relative. As Samuel led them toward the house, he noticed how Lucas positioned himself between his sisters and any potential exit, how he kept glancing back toward the road. The boy was thinking 3 steps ahead, planning escape routes even as he accepted help. 20 years ago, Samuel had run from his own monster. Now it seemed like 3 new ones had found their way to his doorstep, carrying secrets that might be darker than anything he'd left behind in Salt Lake City. The morning wind picked up, rattling the barn doors behind them like bones. The children ate like they hadn't seen food in weeks, which Samuel suspected might be true. He watched from across the kitchen table as the boy, who'd finally given his name as Jake, carefully divided each bite between himself and his sisters before taking any for himself. The younger girl, maybe 4 years old, had auburn curls matted with dust and kept one thumb firmly planted in her mouth. The older one, around 7, possessed the same watchful green eyes as her brother. "More?" Samuel asked, gesturing toward the pot of stew still simmering on the stove. Jake's eyes darted to the pot, then back to Samuel's face, as if searching for some kind of trap. "We're fine, mister." But the little one's stomach growled audibly, betraying the lie. Samuel ladled another portion into her bowl without asking permission. The boy's jaw tightened, but he didn't protest. "You can call me Samuel," he said, settling back into his chair. "Or Mr. Webb, if that suits you better. What are your sisters' names?" "This here's Molly," Jake said, indicating the younger girl. "And that's Ruth." Ruth hadn't spoken a word since they'd come inside, though her eyes tracked every movement Samuel made. Smart girl. Trust didn't come easy out here, and it shouldn't. "How long since you've eaten a proper meal?" Jake's shoulders went rigid. "We get by just fine." "I'm sure you do." Samuel kept his voice neutral. He'd learned long ago that pushing too hard too fast only made people bolt. "Just wondering if you might want to stay the night. Got a spare room upstairs, clean beds, warm blankets. We can't pay you nothing." Wasn't asking for payment. The boy's eyes narrowed with suspicion that belonged on someone 3 times his age. "Why would you help us?" Samuel considered the question. The easy answer was that it was the Christian thing to do, what the Lord expected of his servants. But as he looked at Jake's protective posture, the way the boy positioned himself between his sisters and any potential threat, Samuel recognized something that cut deeper than religious duty. "Had someone help me once when I needed it," he said finally. "Seems right to pass it along." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard. The storm he'd sensed earlier was moving in fast, and travel would be treacherous by morning. "Storm's coming anyway," he added. "Road to town won't be passable until it blows through." Jake glanced toward the window, and Samuel could see the boy weighing their options. Practicality won out over pride. "Just for tonight," Jake said. "We'll be gone first thing." Samuel nodded, though something in his gut told him these children's troubles wouldn't be solved by a single night's shelter. There were signs he'd learned to read over the years, the way Jake flinched when Samuel moved too quickly, how both girls instinctively shrank back from raised voices, the careful way they all sat on the edges of their chairs as if ready to run at the first sign of danger. He'd seen it before, in the mirror mostly, back when he was younger than Jake and trying to navigate a world that seemed determined to break him. "Ruth, you like stories?" he asked the older girl. She looked to Jake for permission before nodding slightly. "Got some books upstairs? Adventures and such. You're welcome to look through them." For the first time, her face showed a flicker of interest. After supper, Samuel led them upstairs to the spare room that had sat empty for longer than he cared to remember. He'd built this house with hopes it would someday hold a family, his own children running through the halls, filling the space with laughter and chaos. But Sarah had taken those dreams with her when she died, along with the unborn child she'd carried. He pushed the memories aside and focused on making sure the children had what they needed. Extra quilts from the cedar chest, a pitcher of water for washing, chamber pot behind the screen in the corner. "I'm just down the hall if you need anything," he told them. "Door doesn't lock, but I give you my word I won't disturb you unless you call for me." Jake studied his face for a long moment, then nodded curtly. As Samuel headed for his own room, he heard the soft sound of furniture being moved. the bed scraping across the floor, probably being positioned against the door. The boy was taking no chances, even with a man who'd shown them nothing but kindness. Samuel understood. Trust was a luxury these children couldn't afford, and their caution spoke of experiences no child should have to endure. Lying in his own bed later, listening to the wind howl around the eaves, Samuel found himself wondering what circumstances had driven 3 children out into the wilderness alone. Whatever it was, he suspected it was worse than simple poverty or even death of parents. Much worse. The morning sun cast long shadows across Samuel's property as he made his way to the barn, a wooden tray balanced in his weathered hands. Steam rose from 3 bowls of oatmeal, and a mason jar of fresh milk caught the early light. He'd risen before dawn, as was his custom, but sleep had eluded him for most of the night. The image of those 3 frightened faces kept surfacing in his mind, particularly the boy's fierce protectiveness and the way the youngest girl had flinched when he'd moved too quickly. Samuel paused outside the barn doors, listening. Silence. For a moment he wondered if they'd slipped away in the darkness, and he was surprised by the disappointment that thought brought. He pushed the door open slowly, announcing his presence with the soft creak of hinges. They were still there, huddled together in the same corner where he'd left them. The boy, he'd said his name was Thomas, was awake, watching Samuel's approach with those same wary eyes. The girls remained curled against him, though Samuel could tell by their breathing that at least one of them was pretending to sleep. "Brought you some breakfast," Samuel said quietly, setting the tray down on a nearby hay bale. "Nothing fancy, but it'll fill your bellies." Thomas didn't move, didn't speak. His arm tightened protectively around his sister's, and Samuel noticed how the boy positioned himself between them and any potential threat, including Samuel himself. "I'm not going to hurt you," Samuel said, then immediately regretted the words. How many times had he heard adults say the same thing to children, making promises they had no intention of keeping? He tried a different approach. "My name's Samuel Webb. This is my ranch. You're welcome to stay until you figure out where you need to go." "We ain't going nowhere," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute determination. "Can't make us." Samuel studied the boy's face, noting the premature hardness around his eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of burdens no child should carry. He recognized something of himself in that expression, the look of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast, to make impossible choices. "Wasn't planning on making you do anything," Samuel replied. He gestured toward the food. "But you should eat, all of you." The smallest girl, she couldn't be more than 4 or 5, lifted her head slightly, her nose twitching at the smell of the warm oatmeal. Her stomach gave an audible growl, and she looked up at Thomas with pleading eyes. "It's all right, Lucy," Thomas murmured, though his gaze never left Samuel. "You can eat." Lucy scrambled toward the tray with the desperate hunger of someone who'd known too many empty meals. The middle girl, who looked to be about 7, followed more cautiously. Thomas remained where he was until both his sisters were seated by the food, then slowly approached, keeping himself between them and Samuel. Samuel watched them eat, noting how Thomas took only small portions, ensuring his sisters had enough first. The boy's selflessness was admirable, but it also confirmed Samuel's growing suspicion that these children had been caring for themselves for far longer than any child should have to. "How long you been on your own?" Samuel asked gently. Thomas's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "We ain't alone. We got each other." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." The boy's jaw tightened. "Long enough." Samuel nodded, recognizing the wall of silence he'd encountered. He'd built similar walls himself once, brick by brick, keeping the world at a safe distance. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. But if someone's looking for you, someone you don't want to find you, well, there are ways to handle that." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes. Fear, maybe, or hope. It was gone so quickly Samuel might have imagined it. "Nobody's looking for us," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. Lucy looked up from her bowl, oatmeal smeared across her chin. "Tommy, what about Lucy?" Thomas's voice was sharp, cutting her off. The little girl's face crumpled, and she looked down at her food, chastened. Samuel felt his chest tighten at the exchange. The boy was protecting them from something, that much was clear. But from what? And at what cost to himself? "There's a creek runs along the north pasture," Samuel said, changing the subject. "Good for washing up if you're of a mind to. And there's clean clothes in the house. Might be a bit big, but they'll do until we can figure something else out." Thomas stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decode some hidden meaning in the offer. Finally, he nodded once, a small gesture that felt like a victory. Samuel stood to leave, then paused at the barn door. "Thomas? Whatever you're running from, you don't have to face it alone anymore." The boy didn't respond. Samuel saw his shoulders tremble slightly, as if the weight he'd been carrying had suddenly become almost too much to bear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Webb ranch as Samuel made his way to the barn, a worn wooden tray balanced in his calloused hands. Steam rose from 3 bowls of oatmeal, and the smell of fresh bread followed him through the crisp air. He'd risen before dawn, as was his custom, but today felt different. The children had changed something fundamental about the rhythm of his solitary life. He found them huddled in the same corner where he'd left them the night before, though the blankets had been carefully folded and stacked. The boy, Daniel, he'd said his name was, stood protectively in front of his sisters, those pale green eyes tracking Samuel's every movement. The younger girls peered around their brother's thin frame, curiosity warring with caution on their dirt-streaked faces. "Brought you some breakfast," Samuel said quietly, setting the tray down on a hay bale. "Nothing fancy, but it'll fill your bellies." Daniel's stomach betrayed him with a loud growl, but he didn't move. His jaw was set with the kind of stubborn pride Samuel recognized, the same pride that had kept Samuel going through the darkest days after Rebecca's death. "It's not poisoned," Samuel added with the ghost of a smile, "though my cooking might make you wish it was." The smallest girl, she couldn't be more than 5, tugged at Daniel's sleeve and whispered something Samuel couldn't catch. Daniel's expression softened as he looked down at her, and Samuel saw the careful way he smoothed her tangled hair. "Go ahead, Lucy," Daniel murmured, "but stay close." The children approached the food like wild animals, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Samuel deliberately turned his back, busying himself with checking the bridle on his horse Jeremiah. He'd learned long ago that frightened creatures, whether human or animal, needed space to feel safe. Behind him, he heard the quiet sounds of eating, followed by soft murmurs of appreciation. When he finally turned around, all 3 bowls were empty, and the children had retreated to their corner again. "Good?" Samuel asked. The middle child, Sarah, he thought, nodded enthusiastically before catching herself and looking to her brother for permission. Daniel's face remained carefully neutral, but Samuel caught the way his shoulders relaxed slightly. "We'll be moving on today," Daniel said, lifting his chin. "Don't want to be a burden." "Where exactly are you planning to move on to?" Samuel asked, settling himself on a nearby stump. "Nearest town is 15 miles through some rough country, and winter's coming. We can manage." The words were spoken with such fierce determination that Samuel felt something twist in his chest. He'd used those exact words countless times himself, to neighbors offering help after Rebecca's funeral, to church elders suggesting he might need guidance, to his own reflection in the mirror during those long, sleepless nights. "I'm sure you can," Samuel said carefully. "But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely." "Nothing's free," Daniel shot back, then seemed to catch himself. His face flushed red. "I mean, we appreciate the food and shelter, but we don't want charity." "Who said anything about charity?" Samuel stood and walked to the barn door, gazing out at the vast expanse of his property. "This ranch doesn't run itself. I could use some help with the animals, mending fences, cleaning stalls. Fair trade for room and board, if you're interested." He heard Daniel's sharp intake of breath and felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on his back. The silence stretched long enough that Samuel began to wonder if he'd overplayed his hand. "What's the catch?" Daniel asked finally. Samuel turned back to face them. "No catch, just honest work for honest pay, though I do have some rules. No lying to me. If I ask a direct question, I get a direct answer, and the first time I catch you trying to leave without telling me, you're gone for good. My land, my rules." Daniel's hand moved protectively to his jacket pocket, a gesture so quick Samuel almost missed it. Almost. In that brief moment, Samuel caught a glimpse of what looked like folded papers, yellow and official-looking. "How long?" Daniel asked. "Long as you need," Samuel replied. "Or until the snows melt, whichever comes first." The boy was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle playing out across his young features. Finally, he looked down at his sisters, Lucy with her thumb in her mouth, Sarah trying to hide behind her brother's sleeve, and his expression crumbled slightly. "All right," he whispered, "but we earn our keep. No handouts." Samuel nodded solemnly. "Wouldn't have it any other way." He paused at the barn door. "You can start by helping me feed the chickens. They're particular about their breakfast schedule." As he walked toward the chicken coop, Samuel found himself wondering what those papers in Daniel's pocket might contain. In his experience, frightened children carrying official documents usually meant one thing: someone was looking for them. The children had been with Samuel for 3 days when he noticed the boy never slept. Oh, Thomas would lie still on the makeshift bed Samuel had arranged in the spare room, would close his eyes and regulate his breathing when Samuel checked on them. But the rancher had caught the telltale signs. The way Thomas's shoulders remained rigid beneath the quilt, how his eyes would snap open the moment a floorboard creaked, alert as a spooked horse. Most telling of all was how the boy positioned himself, always between his sisters and the door, one hand resting near the poker Samuel had foolishly left within reach. Samuel understood that kind of vigilance. It lived in his bones too, a remnant from nights when every sound might herald violence. On the 4th morning, he found Thomas standing at the kitchen window before dawn, watching the eastern horizon with the intensity of a sentry. The boy hadn't heard Samuel's approach. Exhaustion had finally dulled those sharp instincts. "Coffee's not ready yet," Samuel said quietly, not wanting to startle him. Thomas spun around, and for a moment Samuel saw something wild in the boy's eyes, something that spoke of fights for survival. Then the careful mask slipped back into place. "Was just looking at your land," Thomas said. "It's peaceful here." The word came out like he wasn't entirely sure what it meant. Samuel poured water into the coffee pot, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "Your sister's still sleeping?" "Yes, sir." Thomas remained by the window, though his attention was split now between the horizon and Samuel. "They need the rest. We've been traveling hard." "How hard?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Thomas's jaw worked silently, and Samuel could practically see the boy weighing truths against lies, calculating which would serve him better. "Hard enough," Thomas finally said. Samuel lit the stove, the match flame bright in the pre-dawn darkness. "You know, I had a brother once, older than me by 3 years. Always thought it was his job to protect me from our father's fists." He shook the match out, the smell of sulfur sharp and brief, wore himself down to nothing, trying to stand between me and what was coming. Thomas had gone very still. "Thing is," Samuel continued, measuring coffee grounds with steady hands, "sometimes the thing you're protecting people from catches up anyway, and then you're too tired to fight it proper when it does. What happened to your brother?" The question surprised Samuel with its directness. He glanced at Thomas, saw the boy's face had lost some of its careful composure. "He died, trying to shield me from something too big for either of us to handle alone." The coffee grounds scattered into the pot like dark earth. "I learned something that day. Sometimes asking for help isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only thing that saves everybody." Through the window, the first hint of sunrise touched the mountains, painting them deep purple against the lightening sky. Samuel had always found comfort in that sight, the way it promised that darkness never lasted forever. "We can't go home," Thomas said suddenly, the words tumbling out like they'd been dammed up too long. There's nothing left to go back to. Samuel turned to face him fully now. The boy looked impossibly young in the growing light, despite the adult wariness in his eyes. What happened, son? Thomas's composure cracked just slightly. I can't. If they find us, who's looking for you? But the moment of openness passed. Thomas straightened, pulling that protective shell back around himself. Nobody, sir. We're just orphans, like I said, looking for work, looking for a place. Samuel nodded slowly, recognizing the retreat. He'd pushed enough for now. Well, there's plenty of work here if you're willing, and the place is big enough for however long you need it. Relief flickered across Thomas's features before he could hide it. We won't be any trouble, Mr. Webb. I'll make sure of it. I'm not worried about trouble. Samuel poured 2 cups as the coffee finished brewing, offering one to Thomas. I'm more concerned about making sure you and your sisters are safe. The boy's hands shook almost imperceptibly as he accepted the cup. Safe's a luxury we can't afford. Maybe it doesn't have to be. They stood in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the kitchen in shades of gold and amber. Samuel found himself studying the boy's profile, noting the premature lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like someone expecting a blow. Whatever Thomas and his sisters were running from, it was bigger than simple poverty or orphan desperation. Samuel had seen enough violence in his life to recognize its aftermath, and these children carried its weight like stones in their souls. The question was whether Samuel could bear to excavate those stones, knowing what dark truths might lie beneath them. Samuel's hands trembled as he set down his coffee cup, the porcelain clinking against the saucer with more force than intended. Through the kitchen window, he could see Ben sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of cedar with Samuel's old pocket knife. The boy's shoulders were rigid, his head turning at every sound from the barn where his sisters played with the barn cats. 3 days had passed since Samuel had found them, and the boy's vigilance hadn't lessened. If anything, it had intensified. Ben barely slept, and when he did, it was with one ear cocked toward any disturbance. Samuel recognized the posture, the constant alertness of someone who'd learned that safety was temporary and danger could arrive without warning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Samuel stepped onto the porch. Ben's knife stilled mid-stroke, his dark eyes fixing on Samuel with that same wary calculation. "Mind if I sit?" Samuel asked, gesturing to the weathered rocking chair beside the steps. Ben's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. Samuel lowered himself into the chair, its familiar creak a comfort he'd taken for granted until these past sleepless nights. "That's good work," Samuel observed, nodding toward the piece of wood taking shape in Ben's hands. "Someone taught you proper, my pa." The words came out clipped, defensive. Samuel waited, letting the silence stretch between them. In his years of ranching, he'd learned that silence often accomplished what questions couldn't. Animals and humans alike needed space to reveal themselves. Ben's knife resumed its careful paring. He said a man ought to know how to make what he needs with his own hands. Wise words. Samuel rocked gently, the chair's rhythm matching the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. "Your pa still teaching you?" The knife slipped, nicking Ben's thumb. A bead of blood welled up, but the boy didn't flinch. He simply wiped it on his already dirty shirt and continued carving. "No." The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest, a recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. "When did you lose him?" Ben's hands went still again. For a moment, Samuel thought the boy wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely carried over the morning breeze, 3 weeks back, maybe 4. Hard to keep count. Samuel's throat tightened. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Weren't no loss." The bitterness in Ben's voice was sharp enough to cut. He got what was coming to him. Before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching hooves reached them. Both man and boy turned toward the dirt road that led to the ranch, where a lone rider was approaching at an easy pace. Samuel's stomach dropped as he recognized the purposeful gait of Marshal Tucker's bay mare. Ben was on his feet instantly, the wooden carving forgotten as it tumbled to the ground. His hand moved to his hip where a gun belt might rest on an older man, finding only empty air. "You sent word," Ben accused, his voice thick with betrayal. "You told them where we are." "No." Samuel stood slowly, hands visible and open. "I didn't send for anyone." But even as he said it, Samuel remembered Mrs. Henley's probing questions at the Mercantile yesterday. Word traveled fast in small communities, especially word about strangers. He should have expected this. "Ben, listen to me." But the boy was already moving, his slight frame coiled like a spring. "Mattie! Susanna!" His voice cracked with urgency as he called toward the barn. "Come here! Now!" The marshal was close enough now that Samuel could see the star pinned to his vest, the careful way his hand rested near his sidearm. Tucker was a decent man, but he was also thorough. If there were wanted posters circulating, if someone was looking for 3 missing children. "Whatever you're thinking," Samuel said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching rider, "don't run. Not yet." "Why?" Ben's question was a hiss of suspicion. "So you can collect whatever bounty they're offering." The accusation hit Samuel like a physical blow. He turned to face the boy, seeing his own reflection in those haunted eyes, the same distrust, the same bone-deep certainty that the world was divided into predators and prey. "Because," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest, "some fights you can't win by running, and some grown-ups aren't the enemy, even when it feels like they all are." Marshal Tucker was close enough now that Samuel could hear the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs. Behind him he heard the barn door bang open and the quick patter of the girl's feet across the yard. Ben stood frozen between flight and fight, his young face aged by decisions no child should have to make. In that moment, Samuel saw himself 30 years ago, another boy forced to choose between trust and survival, learning too young that the two rarely went hand in hand. The marshal's horse stopped at the gate, and Tucker touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Morning, Samuel. Heard you might have some visitors." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Webb ranch as Samuel stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in his chipped ceramic mug. The children had been with them 3 days now, and while Mary had taken to mothering them with fierce protectiveness, something gnawed at Samuel's gut like a wolf worrying at old bones. Thomas moved wrong. Not the natural awkwardness of youth, but the careful calculation of someone perpetually ready to fight or flee. The boy's eyes tracked every movement, catalogued every sound, and his body remained coiled like a spring, even when he laughed at Mary's gentle teasing. Samuel had seen that particular brand of vigilance before, in the mirror years ago, when every shadow might have hidden his father's belt. The younger ones, Emma and little Jacob, orbited Thomas like planets around their son, seeking his approval before accepting food, before speaking, before breathing too loudly. It wasn't natural sibling deference, it was something harder, more desperate. Samuel took a long sip of coffee and watched Thomas emerge from the barn, hay dust coating his shoulders. The boy worked with methodical precision, completing every task Samuel set for him as if his life depended on perfection. Yesterday, when Samuel had mentioned a loose board on the chicken coop, Thomas had nearly torn apart the entire structure in his eagerness to fix not just the problem, but every potential problem. "You're thinking too hard again," Mary said, appearing beside him with her own cup. "I can practically hear those wheels grinding." "Boy's scared," Samuel said quietly. "Course he is. They're all scared. Probably haven't had a proper home in months." Samuel shook his head. "Not that kind of scared. This is different. Deeper." Mary studied Thomas as he carefully stacked wood near the barn door, each piece aligned with mathematical precision. "Maybe you're seeing things that aren't there. Maybe you're remembering things that are." The words hit harder than she'd intended, and Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest. His own childhood lurked in every corner of his perception, painting innocent moments with shadows that might or might not exist. How many times had Mary warned him about projecting his past onto the present? Could be, he admitted, but his instinct screamed otherwise. Thomas approached the porch, wiping his hands on his pants. "Mr. Webb, sir, I finished with the wood. Is there something else you need done?" The formality was another red flag. Most children Thomas's age called him Samuel or Sir occasionally, but Thomas used titles like Armor, maintaining distance even while seeking approval. "Wood looks good," Samuel said. "Why don't you take a break? Maybe see what Emma and Jacob are up to with Mrs. Webb." Something flickered across Thomas's face, panic quickly suppressed. "I'm not tired, sir. I can keep working. I want to earn my keep." There it was again, that desperate need to justify his existence through labor, as if rest might result in punishment or abandonment. Mary crouched to Thomas's eye level. "Honey, you don't need to earn anything here. This is your home now, remember? Homes don't come with conditions." Thomas nodded too quickly, the gesture automatic rather than convinced. "Yes, ma'am, I know. But I like to work. It feels good to help." Samuel recognized the careful dance of words designed to please adults while avoiding commitment or vulnerability. He'd perfected similar speeches as a child, agreeing to whatever kept the peace while never quite believing safety could last. "Tell you what," Samuel said. "Help me check the fence line this afternoon. Man's work, not chores. We'll take the horses." For the first time since arriving, Thomas's composure cracked slightly. Real interest sparked in his eyes before caution smothered it. "You'd trust me with a horse?" The question revealed more than Thomas likely intended. Trust wasn't something he expected from adults, even after 3 days of consistent kindness. "Course I would. You've got good hands, steady disposition. Horses respond to that." Mary squeezed Samuel's shoulder, a warning to tread carefully, not to push too hard or fast. But Samuel had spent years learning to read the subtle languages of fear, and Thomas was practically shouting distress signals in a dozen different dialects. "I'll get the horses ready after lunch," Thomas said, then hesitated. "Sir, thank you for letting us stay, for everything." As the boy headed back toward the house, Samuel caught Mary's concerned look. She'd begun to see it too, the cracks in Thomas's carefully maintained facade, the weight he carried like rocks in his pockets. "Whatever happened to them," Mary said quietly, "it wasn't just abandonment." Samuel nodded, watching through the window as Thomas positioned himself between his siblings and the door, even during Mary's reading lesson. Always watching, always ready, always protecting. The question wasn't whether something terrible had driven these children to his barn. The question was whether Samuel had the strength to face whatever truth Thomas was so desperately hiding. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Webb ranch as Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching the 3 children through the glass. They sat on the porch steps, sharing a plate of biscuits and honey that Rebecca had prepared before dawn. The sight should have warmed him, but instead, a cold knot of unease settled deeper in his stomach. Something about the boy's constant vigilance reminded Samuel too much of himself at that age. Always watching, always waiting for the next blow to fall. "You're brooding again," Rebecca said softly, joining him at the window. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of another sleepless night. "I can practically hear the wheels turning in your head." Samuel's jaw tightened. The boy won't let those girls out of his sight, won't even let them go to the privy alone. "That ain't normal protective behavior, Rebecca. That's fear. Maybe they've just been through something terrible. Maybe nothing." Samuel turned from the window, his voice harder than he intended. "I know what I'm seeing. Same way I knew when Pa was about to lose his temper. Same way I learned to read every sign, every warning." He paused, the admission hanging heavy between them. "Someone's been hurting those children, hurting them bad." Rebecca reached for his hand, her fingers cool against his calloused palm. "Then we help them, whatever it takes." Before Samuel could respond, a sharp cry cut through the morning air. They rushed to the window to see little Mary standing at the bottom of the porch steps, tears streaming down her face. She'd apparently fallen, her small hands scraped and bleeding from catching herself on the gravel. What happened next confirmed every suspicion Samuel harbored. The boy, Thomas, dropped to his knees beside his sister, but instead of comforting her, he began frantically looking around, his young face twisted with panic. "Shh, Mary, please don't cry," he whispered urgently, his voice carrying through the open window. "He'll hear you. Papa will hear you crying, and he'll—" The boy's words dissolved into incoherent murmurs as he tried desperately to quiet his sister's sobs. Even Sarah, barely older than Mary herself, crouched down with the same terrified urgency. "Please, Mary," she begged, "remember what happened last time. Remember what Papa did when you cried about your arm?" Samuel's blood turned to ice. Without conscious thought he was moving, his boots hitting the porch boards with heavy thuds. All three children looked up at his approach, and the raw terror that flashed across their faces nearly brought him to his knees. Thomas immediately positioned himself between Samuel and his sisters, his thin arms spread wide despite the way his whole body trembled. "Please, mister," the boy whispered, his voice breaking. "Please don't hurt them. I'll take it instead. I always take it instead." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, stealing his breath and sending him stumbling backward. For a moment, he wasn't a grown man on his own ranch. He was 8 years old again, standing between his drunken father and his weeping mother, promising to be good, promising to take whatever punishment was coming if only Pa would leave Ma alone. "Son," Samuel managed, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite contain, "I'm not going to hurt anyone. Not you, not your sisters, not ever." But Thomas wasn't listening. The boy's eyes had gone glassy, distant, as if he wasn't entirely present. "I should have been watching better," he mumbled, more to himself than to Samuel. "Should have caught her before she fell. Papa says it's my job to watch them, to keep them quiet, to make sure they don't—" His voice cracked entirely, and he pressed his small hands over his ears as if trying to block out sounds only he could hear. Rebecca appeared at Samuel's shoulder, moving slowly and deliberately as she approached the children. She knelt carefully in front of Mary, her movements gentle and unthreatening. "Let me see those scrapes, sweetheart," she said softly. "We'll get you cleaned up." "Thomas," Samuel said, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the rage building in his chest. Not at the children, never at them, but at whoever had done this. "Your sister got hurt by accident. Nobody's in trouble. Nobody's going to get hurt because she fell down." The boy's eyes focused on Samuel's face, searching for deception, for the signs of violence that had apparently become as familiar to him as breathing. "Papa says accidents happen because we're not careful enough," Thomas whispered. "Says we have to learn to be more careful." Samuel crouched down slowly, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "Your papa was wrong, son. Sometimes accidents just happen, and when they do, we help each other. We don't hurt each other." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, hope warring with disbelief, desperate want fighting against learned fear. Around them, the morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, but Samuel barely noticed. All his attention focused on these 3 broken children and the growing certainty that helping them would mean confronting everything he'd spent years trying to forget. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Webb ranch as Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching the 3 children help Mary with the chickens. 2 weeks had passed since they'd arrived, and while the girls had begun to open up, David remained a coiled spring, always watching, always ready to shield his sisters from some unseen threat. Samuel had seen that look before, in his own reflection years ago, when trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The boy carried himself like a soldier in enemy territory, and it troubled Samuel more than he cared to admit. "They're settling in well," Mary said, joining him at the window. She carried a telegram in her weathered hands, and Samuel's stomach tightened at the sight of it. "What's that?" "Came in this morning. Sheriff Morrison's been asking around about missing children. No reports matching our 3. She paused, studying his face. "Sometimes that's good news, Samuel. Sometimes it's not." Samuel took the telegram, scanning the brief message. No missing persons reports, no frantic parents searching, just silence, which in his experience was often louder than screams. A commotion outside drew their attention. David had stepped between little Rose and one of the roosters, his thin frame taut with protective fury. The bird was merely establishing dominance over the feed scattered on the ground, but David reacted as if facing down a mountain lion. "Easy there," Emma called to her brother, her voice carrying that particular tone Samuel had noticed. Calm but careful, like someone accustomed to diffusing dangerous situations. "It's just Bartholomew showing off." The boy's shoulders remained rigid until Rose was safely behind him, her small hand clutching his shirt. Only then did David seem to remember where he was, color flooding his pale cheeks as he realized the adults were watching. Samuel stepped onto the porch. "David, could you help me with something in the barn?" The invitation was casual, but David's response was anything but. His eyes darted to his sisters, then to the house, calculating distances and escape routes with the precision of someone who'd needed such knowledge before. "The girls will be fine with Mary," Samuel added gently. "Won't take long." After a moment's hesitation, David nodded, but kept glancing back at Emma and Rose as they walked toward the barn. Inside, Samuel busied himself with organizing tack, giving the boy time to settle. "You did good out there," Samuel finally said. Looking after Rose, David's jaw tightened. "Someone has to. Emma seems plenty capable herself. Emma's just a kid." The words came out sharp, defensive. "She tries, but she don't understand how things really are." Samuel hung a bridle on its peg, choosing his words carefully. "How are things really, David?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the distant murmur of feminine voices from the yard. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You ever been someplace where being quiet meant staying alive?" The question hit Samuel like a physical blow. He turned to find David watching him with eyes too old for his young face, and Samuel saw himself at 12, crammed into a space too small, waiting for his father's rage to pass. "Yes," Samuel said simply, "I have." Something shifted in David's expression, surprise maybe, or recognition. "Then you know. You know why I can't." He gestured helplessly toward the yard where his sisters played. "They think we're safe now. But people like us, we don't get safe. We just get borrowed time." Samuel leaned against the stall door, fighting the urge to tell the boy he was wrong, that safety was possible, that this place could be different. Instead, he asked, "What are you running from, son?" David's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "What makes you think we're running from something? Maybe we're running to something. Are you?" The boy's composure cracked just for a moment, and Samuel glimpsed the terror beneath the bravado. "I don't know anymore. I thought I did, but—" He kicked at the hay-strewn floor. "How do you tell if a place is really safe, or if it's just waiting to turn on you?" Samuel's throat tightened. He remembered asking his reflection that same question, night after night, in the years after he'd first come to this ranch. "I reckon you test it bit by bit, see if it holds. And if it doesn't, then you run again. But maybe, if you're lucky, you find a place that does hold. Maybe you find people who won't let you fall." David looked up at him, searching his face for lies or false promises. Samuel held the boy's gaze, offering no easy answers, no guarantees, just the truth that sometimes, against all odds and past experience, trust could be rebuilt. Outside, Rose's delighted laughter rang across the yard like church bells, and for the first time since their arrival, David didn't flinch at the sound. The dawn light filtered through the kitchen windows as Samuel poured coffee into 2 cups, his hands steadier than they'd been in days. Across the table, Sheriff Morrison sat hunched forward, his weathered face grave, as he studied the telegram that had arrived an hour earlier. "Says here the Hartwell place burned down 3 weeks ago," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whole family presumed dead in the fire. Local sheriff in Millfield found remains of 2 adults, but he paused, looking up at Samuel. No children's bodies recovered. Samuel's grip tightened around his coffee cup. Through the window he could see the children playing near the corral, little Mary chasing a butterfly while Ben watched over her with that perpetual vigilance that now made terrible sense. Emma sat apart, braiding grass stems with the focused intensity she brought to everything, as if staying busy could keep the memories at bay. "Fire wasn't an accident, was it?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer from Morrison's expression. "Appears not. Millfield Sheriff mentions they're looking for a man named Caleb Hartwell, the children's uncle. Seems he had gambling debts, got mixed up with some rough characters from Denver. Word is he owed money to the wrong people." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Samuel remembered Ben's terrified reaction to any loud noise, the way all 3 children flinched when strangers approached. They hadn't just lost their parents, they'd witnessed something no child should ever see. "There's more," Morrison continued, his voice heavy. "Sheriff down there says Caleb's been spotted in the territory, asking questions about children matching their description in towns along the railroad." Samuel's blood went cold. "He's looking for them." "Appears so. Question is why? Could be guilt, could be family obligation, or—" Morrison trailed off, but Samuel caught his meaning. "Or he needs to make sure there's no witnesses to what really happened." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of implications settling between them. Outside, Ben had moved closer to his sisters, his small body tense as a rider approached in the distance. Even from here, Samuel could see the boy's protective instincts kicking in, ready to shield Mary and Emma from whatever threat might emerge. The rider turned out to be Thomas Wheeler, Samuel's nearest neighbor, coming to borrow some tools. But watching Ben's reaction, the way he'd instinctively stepped forward, placing himself between the approaching stranger and his sisters, Samuel felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. "What are you thinking, Sam?" Morrison asked, noting the change in his friend's demeanor. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, memories of his own childhood surfacing unbidden, the fear, the helplessness, the desperate need for someone, anyone, to stand between him and the violence that had shaped his early years. His father's drunken rages, his mother's silent suffering, the terrible weight of responsibility he'd carried as the oldest child. "I'm thinking those children have been through enough," Samuel said finally. "And I'm thinking that if Caleb Hartwell wants to find them, he'll have to go through me first." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying his friend's face. "That's a dangerous path you're considering. These aren't just local troublemakers we're talking about. If Caleb's mixed up with Denver crime families, then we'd better be prepared." Samuel's voice carried a steel that Morrison hadn't heard since their army days. "How long before word gets out that I've taken in 3 children? This is a small territory and people talk." "Not long," Morrison admitted, "especially if Caleb's offering money for information." Samuel stood and walked to the window, watching as Ben helped Mary climb onto the corral fence, while Emma continued her methodical braiding. Such ordinary childhood moments, yet shadowed by an evil that had already stolen too much from these young lives. "There's something else," Morrison said quietly. "The telegram mentions that before the fire, neighbors reported seeing the children were, well, they were already scared. Bruises, flinching, the usual signs. Seems their uncle had been staying with the family for months before it happened." The final piece clicked into place. Caleb hadn't just killed his brother and sister-in-law for money. He'd been abusing the children first, and now he was hunting them, either to silence them forever or to continue what he'd started. Samuel turned from the window, his decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. "I need you to send some telegrams for me." Quietly. "To who?" "Some old army contacts. Men who know how to handle themselves in situations like this." Samuel's jaw tightened. "If Caleb Hartwell wants a fight, we'll give him one. But it'll be on our terms, not his." Morrison nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what Samuel was proposing. They weren't just talking about protecting 3 orphaned children anymore. They were talking about war. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn floor as Samuel finished milking the cows, but his mind wasn't on the familiar routine. 3 days had passed since he'd spoken with Sheriff Morrison, and the weight of unspoken truths pressed heavier with each sunrise. The children moved through their daily tasks with mechanical precision, but he could see the cracks forming in their carefully constructed facade. Joseph had grown increasingly agitated, his protective instincts sharpening to a razor's edge whenever Samuel approached his sisters. The boy's eyes held the same haunted wariness Samuel had seen in his own reflection years ago, back when every shadow might conceal his father's fist and every footstep on the porch spelled potential violence. As Samuel carried the milk pails toward the house, he noticed Emma sitting alone by the water trough, her small hands working at something in her lap. She looked up as he approached, quickly hiding whatever occupied her attention behind her back. "Morning, Emma," Samuel said, setting down the pails and crouching to her level. "What have you got there?" She shook her head, dark curls bouncing. Nothing. But Samuel had caught a glimpse of blue fabric, and his chest tightened. "May I see?" Emma's lower lip trembled, but slowly she brought her hands forward. In her small palms lay a doll made from scraps of cloth, the same blue as the dress she'd worn when they first arrived. The doll's face bore careful stitching where someone had sewn features with loving detail. "She's beautiful," Samuel said softly. "Did you make her?" "Mama made her," Emma whispered. "Before she went away." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He forced his voice to remain steady. "What was your mama's name?" Emma's eyes darted toward the barn, where Joseph was forking hay. "Joseph says I'm not supposed to tell." "Joseph wants to keep you safe," Samuel said. "I understand that, but sometimes keeping secrets can hurt more than it helps." Emma clutched the doll tighter. "Mama said if anything bad happened, we should find help. But then the bad men came, and Mama couldn't come with us." Samuel's blood chilled. "What bad men, Emma?" Before she could answer, Joseph appeared around the corner of the barn, his face darkening when he saw them talking. He strode over with the purposeful gait of someone far older than his years. "Emma, go help Ruth with the chickens," he ordered, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Emma scrambled to her feet, tucking the doll into her apron pocket. She cast one apologetic glance at Samuel before hurrying away. Joseph watched her go, then turned to face Samuel with defiant eyes. "You got no right questioning her." "I have every right," Samuel replied, rising to his full height. "This is my land, and you're under my protection, but I can't protect what I don't understand. We don't need your protection." "Don't you?" Samuel stepped closer, noting how Joseph's hands clenched into fists. "You're running from something, son, all three of you. And whatever it is, it's eating you alive." Joseph's composure cracked slightly. "You don't know nothing about it." "I know about running," Samuel said quietly. "I know about being afraid to sleep because the nightmares come. I know about watching every shadow, waiting for the devil to catch up with you." The boy's eyes widened, and for a moment, the careful mask slipped entirely. Samuel saw the terrified child beneath the protective facade, the boy carrying burdens too heavy for his young shoulders. "My father was a violent man," Samuel continued. "Beat my mother until she couldn't stand, then started on me. I ran when I was 14, lived rough for years before I found my way here. Found peace." Joseph stared at him, processing this revelation. "What happened to him?" "He died drunk in a ditch outside Salt Lake City," Samuel said. "But not before he nearly destroyed everyone who loved him." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of Ruth's laughter as she chased chickens with Emma. Joseph's shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight he carried had shifted but not lessened. "The men who hurt your mother," Samuel said gently. "Are they the ones you're running from?" Joseph's jaw worked silently for several moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They'll come looking. They always do. Not if they can't find you. They found us before. That's how Mama—" Joseph's voice broke, and he turned away, struggling to maintain his composure. Samuel placed a careful hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the tension coiled in those thin muscles. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore, Joseph. Whatever happened, whatever you've seen, you don't have to face it by yourself." Joseph shrugged away from the touch, but his defiance seemed hollow now. "You say that now, but when you know the truth, when you understand what we brought to your door, you'll send us away just like everyone else." The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as Samuel walked toward the house, his boots crunching on frost-covered ground. Through the kitchen window, he could see Martha moving about, preparing breakfast, while the children sat at the table. The sight should have brought him comfort, but instead his chest tightened with each step. Inside, he found them exactly as he'd expected, Thomas positioned where he could see every entrance, his body angled protectively toward his sisters. The boy's eyes tracked Samuel's movement as he hung his hat on the peg by the door. "Morning," Samuel said, his voice deliberately gentle. He'd spent half the night thinking about what Sheriff Morrison had told him, about the questions that needed asking and the truths that needed facing. "Morning, Mr. Webb," Thomas replied, his tone carefully neutral. The boy had mastered the art of saying just enough to avoid suspicion while revealing nothing of substance. Martha set a plate of eggs and bacon before Samuel, her hand briefly touching his shoulder. The gesture was meant to be reassuring, but he could feel the tension in her fingers. She'd seen the change in him since the sheriff's visit, though she hadn't pressed for details. "Thomas," Samuel said after a few bites, "I was thinking you might come help me mend the fence line today. That storm last week brought down some posts." The boy's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What about Emma and Lily? They can help Martha with the washing. Plenty of work for everyone." Thomas glanced at his sisters, and Samuel caught the almost imperceptible shake of Emma's head. It was so slight he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching for exactly that kind of communication. "I should stay here," Thomas said finally, "help with the heavy lifting for the wash." Samuel nodded as if he'd expected the answer, though his heart sank. Every instinct told him to let it go, to preserve the fragile peace they'd built. But Morrison's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the kindest thing was the hardest thing. "Actually," Martha interjected, surprising them all, "I think Thomas should go with you, Samuel. The girls and I can manage just fine, can't we?" Emma's eyes went wide, and Lily stopped eating entirely. Thomas's jaw tightened, and for a moment Samuel thought the boy might refuse outright. "It's settled then," Samuel said, standing before anyone could protest further. "We'll head out after breakfast." An hour later, Samuel led Thomas toward the damaged fence line, their tools clanking softly with each step. The boy walked slightly behind him, alert and tense, like a wild animal ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. They worked in silence for a while, pulling down broken boards and digging out damaged posts. Samuel found himself watching Thomas's movements, noting how the boy constantly positioned himself with a clear view back toward the house, how he flinched whenever Samuel moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. "Thomas," Samuel said finally, setting down his hammer, "we need to talk." The boy's whole body went rigid. "About what?" "About why you and your sisters were really traveling alone. About what you're so afraid of." "I told you. You told me what you thought I needed to hear to keep you safe. But son, I can't protect you if I don't know what I'm protecting you from." Thomas backed away a step, his hands curling into fists. "You don't understand. Nobody understands. Try me." The words hung in the cold air between them. Samuel could see the war playing out across the boy's face, the desperate need to trust warring with whatever terrible experience had taught him that trust was dangerous. "He'll find us," Thomas whispered finally. "No matter where we go, he'll find us." Samuel's blood chilled. "Who will find you?" Thomas shook his head violently. "I can't. If I tell you, you'll make us leave. Everyone makes us leave." The pain in the boy's voice was like a physical blow. Samuel took a careful step closer, his hands open and visible. "Thomas, look at me, look at me." Reluctantly, the boy raised his eyes. I give you my word, my solemn promise before God, that whatever you tell me, I will not send you away. You and your sisters have a home here for as long as you need it." Something cracked in Thomas's carefully constructed armor. His shoulders began to shake, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he was, a terrified child carrying a burden far too heavy for his young shoulders. "He's our father," Thomas said, the words barely audible, "and he's going to kill us all if he finds us." The simple statement hit Samuel like a physical blow, confirming his darkest suspicions while simultaneously making everything worse, because now he understood that the real battle wasn't just about keeping 3 children safe. It was about confronting the kind of evil that wore a father's face, the same evil that had once lived under his own roof. The morning sun cast long shadows across the churchyard as Samuel helped Miriam down from the wagon. The children stayed close behind him, their Sunday clothes freshly pressed but their faces still carrying that watchful wariness he'd grown accustomed to. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Garrett, yet David still positioned himself between his sisters and any approaching stranger. "Brother Webb," Bishop Morrison's voice carried across the yard, warm but measured. Samuel had been expecting this conversation since he'd first brought the children to services. The bishop approached with deliberate steps, his silver beard neatly trimmed, eyes kind but probing. "Bishop." Samuel removed his hat, feeling the familiar weight of judgment that had followed him since his return from the war. "Fine morning for worship." "Indeed." Morrison's gaze shifted to the children, who had moved closer to Samuel's side. "These must be the young ones I've been hearing about. The talk in town is varied." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd noticed the whispers, the way conversations stopped when he entered the general store. Some folks saw Christian charity in taking in orphans. Others saw something more troubling, a man with a violent past collecting damaged children like himself. "They needed a home," Samuel said simply. Of course. The bishop's tone remained diplomatic, though there are proper channels for such arrangements. The territorial authorities, the church welfare committee, we have procedures. Mary pressed closer to Samuel's leg, her small hand gripping his coat. The gesture wasn't lost on Bishop Morrison, whose expression softened slightly. "They've been through enough upheaval," Samuel said, his voice carrying an edge that made several nearby congregation members glance their way. "Procedures can wait until they've had time to heal. I understand your compassion, Brother Webb, but there are concerns, questions about legitimacy, about your qualifications to care for children, given your circumstances." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Samuel felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, the same rage that had carried him through too many battles that had nearly consumed him in the months after his return. His hand instinctively moved toward his hip, where his gun would have rested in another time. Miriam's gentle touch on his arm brought him back to himself. Her eyes held both warning and support, reminding him where he was, who he was trying to be. "My circumstances," Samuel said carefully, "are that I have a home, means to provide, and a willingness to care for children who have nowhere else to go. If that's not qualification enough, perhaps we should discuss what exactly disqualifies a man from Christian service." The bishop's cheeks reddened. Around them, the churchyard had grown quiet, conversations fading as people strained to hear the exchange. Samuel could feel David behind him, tense and ready to run, probably calculating the distance to the wagon, the fastest route home. "Now see here, Webb." "Samuel." Miriam's voice cut through the tension, firm but gentle. "Perhaps we should take our seats. Service is about to begin." She moved forward, addressing Bishop Morrison with the same grace she brought to everything. "Brother Morrison, surely we can discuss any concerns after worship. The children are still adjusting to being in town, around so many people." As if to underscore her point, little Emma moved to hide behind David, her eyes wide with the kind of fear Samuel recognized too well. The boy's face had gone pale, his breathing shallow. Samuel realized the confrontation was triggering something in David, some memory of other adults arguing over his fate while he stood helpless. "Of course, Sister Webb," Morrison's voice had lost some of its authority. "We'll speak later." Samuel knelt down, bringing himself to David's eye level. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Just for the boy. No one's taking you anywhere. I give you my word." David nodded shakily, but Samuel could see the doubt lingering there. The boy had heard promises before from adults who'd failed to keep them. Trust, Samuel was learning, wasn't given. It was earned in small moments, proven through consistency, built one kept promise at a time. As they made their way into the chapel, Samuel felt the weight of watching eyes, heard the rustle of whispers that followed their passage down the aisle. He'd faced enemy cavalry with less trepidation than he felt walking these few dozen steps with 3 children who depended on him. They settled into a pew near the middle, the children flanking Samuel and Miriam like small sentinels. As the organ began its opening hymn, Samuel bowed his head, not in prayer but in a moment of stark recognition. He'd thought the hardest battles were behind him, left on distant battlefields among the dead. But this, protecting these children, earning their trust, proving himself worthy of their faith, might be the fight that truly tested who he was becoming. The hymn swelled around them, voices raised in harmony, and for a moment Samuel allowed himself to hope that grace might yet cover the multitude of his sins. Samuel's hands trembled as he set down the telegram, the paper crackling in the pre-dawn silence of his kitchen. The words burned in his mind. Silas Kane escaped custody stop, considered armed and dangerous stop, last seen heading west stop. 3 days. The man had been free for 3 days, and Samuel was only learning about it now. He pressed his palms against the rough wooden table, trying to steady himself, but the old familiar terror was already creeping up his spine like ice water. Through the kitchen window, he could see the first pale hints of sunrise touching the mountains. The children would be waking soon, expecting breakfast, expecting the safety he'd promised them. David especially had begun to trust him, the boy's constant vigilance finally starting to ease after weeks of careful patience. Samuel closed his eyes and saw Silas Kane as he'd last seen him in that courtroom, lean as a wolf, with pale eyes that missed nothing and a smile that promised retribution. The man had made threats then, specific threats about what he'd do to anyone who testified against him. Samuel had been the key witness, the one whose testimony had put Kane behind bars. The floorboards creaked overhead, and Samuel quickly folded the telegram, shoving it into his shirt pocket. He couldn't let the children see his fear. They'd lived with enough terror already. He was lighting the stove when David appeared in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, but eyes already alert. The boy never truly let his guard down, even here. "Morning, son," Samuel said, forcing normalcy into his voice. "Sleep well?" David shrugged, moving to the water basin to wash his face. Emma had another nightmare. About the fire. Samuel's chest tightened. The little girl's dreams had been getting better, but stress could bring them back with vicious intensity. "Is she all right now?" "Sarah's with her." David dried his hands and turned to study Samuel's face with that unnerving directness. "You look tired. Didn't you sleep?" Too perceptive, this boy. Samuel busied himself with the coffee, measuring grounds with hands that wanted to shake, just thinking about the harvest. Lots to do before winter. It wasn't entirely a lie, but David's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced either. The boy had developed a keen sense for when adults were holding back information. Sarah came down a few minutes later, carrying Emma on her hip. The youngest child clung to her sister like a koala, face buried against Sarah's shoulder. "She'll be all right," Sarah said quietly, settling Emma into her chair at the table. Just took her a while to remember where she was. Samuel served breakfast, eggs and bacon, fresh bread with honey, and tried to maintain the peaceful routine they'd built over the past month. But his mind kept drifting to the telegram in his pocket, to the implications of Kane's escape. The man was a killer, pure and simple. He'd murdered at least 3 people that they knew of, probably more. And he had a long memory for grudges. "Samuel?" Sarah's voice cut through his dark thoughts. "You haven't touched your food." He looked down at his plate, surprised to find it still full. "Sorry, just distracted." Emma had finally lifted her head and was picking at her eggs. Her nightmares always left her pale and fragile looking, emphasizing how young she really was. 8 years old and already carrying more trauma than most adults. "I need to ride into town today," Samuel said, making the decision as he spoke. "Pick up some supplies before the weather turns." David looked up sharply. "Can we come?" "Not today. I'd rather you all stayed here," helped Margaret with the preserving. Samuel caught David's eye, trying to communicate something without alarming the girls. "Keep close to the house." Understanding flickered across the boy's face, not of the specifics, but of the underlying tension. David nodded slowly. After breakfast, Samuel saddled his horse with grim efficiency. He needed to talk to Sheriff Morrison, needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with. Cain was cunning and patient, qualities that made him infinitely more dangerous than a common desperado. As he prepared to leave, David appeared at the barn door. "It's him, isn't it?" the boy said without preamble. "Our father. He's coming." Samuel's blood ran cold. "What makes you say that?" "You get the same look Emma gets before her nightmares. Like something's hunting you." David stepped closer, his young face set with determination. "We won't let him hurt you. You saved us. We'll save you too." The fierce loyalty in the boy's voice nearly undid Samuel completely. Here was a child who'd already faced hell, offering to stand against it again for someone who'd shown him kindness. Samuel gripped David's shoulder. "That's not your job, son. Protecting people. That's what adults do. Then let us help." Samuel mounted his horse, looking down at this remarkable boy who'd grown up too fast, too hard. "You help by keeping your sisters safe. Can you do that for me?" David nodded, but his expression remained troubled as Samuel rode toward town and whatever news waited there. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Samuel watched Deputy Martinez's horse disappear over the ridge. The federal marshals would arrive within 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather turned. He'd done what needed doing, but the weight of it settled heavy on his shoulders like a yoke he couldn't shake. Inside the house, he found the children at the kitchen table. Eliza had managed to coax them into eating eggs and biscuits, though little Mary still picked at her food with the careful hesitation of someone who'd learned not to trust plenty. Thomas sat straighter now, his shoulders less rigid, but his eyes still tracked every movement Samuel made. "We need to talk," Samuel said, settling into the chair across from them. "All of us." Ruth looked up from her plate, syrup sticky on her chin. "Are you sending us away?" The question hit harder than he'd expected. Samuel glanced at Eliza, who was standing by the stove with her arms crossed, that particular look on her face that meant she'd already made up her mind about something. "The law's coming," he said carefully. "Federal marshals. They'll want to talk to you about your uncle, about what happened." Thomas's fork clattered against his plate. "You promised." "I promised to keep you safe. And that's what I'm doing." Samuel leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Those men who came here, they're not going to stop. And there are things about your uncle, about what he was involved in, that go deeper than just him hurting you children." "What kind of things?" Thomas asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected. Samuel had wrestled with how much to tell them. They were children, but they'd already seen more darkness than most adults. Protecting them meant preparing them for what was coming. "Your uncle was part of a network," he said. "Men who traded in things that shouldn't be traded. The marshals, they've been tracking this group for months. You 3, you're witnesses to more than just what happened in that house." Mary spoke for the first time that morning, her voice barely a whisper. "The other children." Samuel's blood went cold. "What other children, sweetheart?" "The ones who came and went," she said, not looking up from her plate. "Uncle Jeremiah said they were visiting, but they cried at night, and then they'd be gone." Eliza's sharp intake of breath cut through the kitchen silence. Samuel felt something dark and familiar rising in his chest, the same rage that had nearly consumed him years ago when he'd found his own sister's body in that mining camp brothel. "How many?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Thomas answered, his voice hollow. "Different ones. Sometimes 2 or 3 at once. They never stayed long." He paused, swallowing hard. "I think that's what he was planning for Mary." The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock. Samuel's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. All those years of trying to outrun his past, of building something clean and good on this land, and here it was again, the same evil that had taken his sister, that had driven him to violence he'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. "Samuel," Eliza said softly, and he heard the warning in her voice. He looked up to find all 3 children watching him with wide eyes. Thomas had unconsciously moved to shield his sisters, that old protective instinct kicking in even here, even now. Samuel forced his hands to unclench, made his voice steady. "Those other children, they're going to need justice too. The marshals. They'll want to know everything you can remember about them. Names, descriptions, anything your uncle might have said about where they came from or where they went. Will it help them?" Ruth asked. "I hope so," Samuel said, and meant it. Eliza moved to the table, her hand coming to rest on Mary's shoulder. "What happens to us when the marshals are done asking questions?" That was the heart of it, wasn't it? Samuel looked at these 3 broken children who'd somehow found their way to his barn, to his life, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the rage that had driven him for so many years, but something warmer. Something like the peace he'd thought he'd found when he'd first bought this land. "That depends," he said slowly, "on what you want to happen." Thomas's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this ranch has plenty of room, plenty of work for those willing to do it, and Eliza's been after me for years to think about expanding the family." He looked at his wife, saw the soft smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "If you want to stay, if you want to call this place home, then as far as I'm concerned, that's what it is." Mary looked up then, really looked at him for the first time since they'd arrived. "Forever?" "Forever," Samuel said, and felt the weight of the promise settle into his bones. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Samuel stood at his kitchen window, watching the children play in the yard. 3 weeks had passed since Jacob's confession about their father, 3 weeks since the telegram confirming Thomas Hartwell's death in a Denver saloon brawl. The weight of what came next pressed against Samuel's chest like a stone. Emma's laughter carried on the wind as she chased one of the barn cats, her once hollow cheeks now fuller, her eyes bright with the kind of joy Samuel had never imagined possible when he'd first found them. Little Thomas tottered after her on unsteady legs, babbling happily in the way children do when they feel safe. Even Jacob, still cautious and watchful, had begun to smile. They deserved better than uncertainty. Samuel pulled the letter from his vest pocket, the one that had arrived yesterday from the territorial authorities. The words blurred as he read them again, though he knew them by heart. The children would be placed in an orphanage in Salt Lake City unless a suitable guardian could be found. The process would begin within the week. The front door creaked open behind him. "Brother Webb?" Samuel turned to find Elder Morrison entering, hat in hand. The church leader's expression was grave, and Samuel knew without asking why he'd come. "Elder Morrison," Samuel folded the letter carefully. "I've been expecting you." The bishop received word from the territorial office about the children. Morrison's voice carried the practiced sympathy of a man accustomed to delivering difficult news. "These are trying circumstances, Samuel. No one questions your Christian charity in caring for them these past weeks." Samuel said nothing, waiting for the inevitable qualification. "But we must consider what's best for everyone involved. These children, they're not of our faith. The boy's already shown signs of violent tendencies, and with your own history." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Samuel felt the familiar shame rise in his throat, the weight of old sins that never seemed to grow lighter despite years of penance. "My history," Samuel repeated quietly. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "The incident with your brother. We know you've repented, that you've lived righteously since joining our community. But caring for damaged children, especially a boy who's known violence, it could be challenging. Perhaps it would be better if they were placed with a proper family, people trained to handle such difficulties." Through the window, Samuel watched Jacob teaching Emma how to braid rope, his young hands patient and gentle as he guided her fingers. The boy who had killed to protect his siblings, who still woke screaming from nightmares, who flinched whenever anyone moved too quickly, this same boy who sang lullabies to his baby brother and made sure Emma ate before taking a bite himself. "You think I'm unfit," Samuel said. "I think you're a good man who's worked hard to find peace. Why risk that peace? Why burden yourself with children who may never fully heal from what they've endured?" Samuel turned from the window to face Morrison directly. "Because they're not burdens, they're children. Children who will remind you daily of violence and death. Children who may trigger the very darkness you've spent years overcoming." The words struck deep, finding the fear Samuel had tried to bury. What if Morrison was right? What if the rage that had once consumed him, that had led to his brother's death in a moment of terrible anger, what if it surfaced again? What if his attempts to protect these children only brought them more harm? But then he thought of Jacob's small hand in his during those first terrifying nights, of Emma's tentative smile when he'd brought her a rag doll from town, of baby Thomas reaching for him with complete trust. These children had already known the worst that men could do. They needed someone who understood that darkness, who had walked through it and emerged on the other side. "I've made my decision," Samuel said quietly. "I'm petitioning the territorial court for guardianship." Morrison's face tightened. "The church cannot support this, Samuel, not officially. If something were to happen, then it will be on my head alone. And your standing in the community? Your position here?" Samuel had anticipated this ultimatum, though hearing it spoken aloud still cut deep. This community had been his salvation, the place where he'd learned to live with his past rather than run from it. But some things mattered more than belonging. "I'll face whatever consequences come." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then placed his hat back on his head. "I'll pray you're making the right choice, Brother Webb." After Morrison left, Samuel returned to the window. Jacob had noticed the visitor and was watching the house with that old wariness creeping back into his posture. Samuel stepped outside and the boy's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Everything all right?" Jacob asked. Samuel knelt beside the children, gathering them close. Emma climbed into his lap while baby Thomas reached for his beard with curious fingers. "Yes," Samuel said, and for the first time in weeks, he meant it completely. "Everything's going to be just fine." The sheriff's badge caught the morning light as Deputy Carson rode up the dusty path, his horse's hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. Samuel watched from the porch, his weathered hands gripping the wooden rail until his knuckles went white. Behind him, through the screen door, he could hear Sarah humming softly to baby Emma while Thomas practiced his letters at the kitchen table. 3 weeks had passed since that night in the barn when everything changed. 3 weeks since Thomas had finally whispered the truth about what their father had done, about why they'd run. Samuel had held the boy while he trembled and spoke in broken sentences, each word cutting deeper than the last. "Mr. Webb," Carson called out, dismounting with practiced ease. The deputy was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes that reminded Samuel of his own son, Matthew, before the fever took him. "Mind if we talk?" Samuel stepped down from the porch, meeting Carson halfway across the yard. The deputy's expression was serious but not unkind, and Samuel found himself grateful for small mercies. "You found him," Samuel said. "It wasn't a question." Carson nodded slowly. "Virgil Henley. Dead 3 days now, maybe 4. Found him in a ravine about 15 miles north of here. Horse threw him, looks like. Broke his neck in the fall." The words should have brought relief, but Samuel felt only a hollow ache in his chest. Justice, if it could be called that, had come from God's hand rather than man's. He thought of Thomas, who still woke screaming some nights, and wondered if knowing would help the boy sleep easier. "The children?" Carson asked. "Safe," Samuel replied. "They're safe." Carson studied Samuel's face for a long moment. "There's been talk, you know, about you taking them in so sudden-like. Some folks wondering about the legal aspects of it all." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting this, dreading it. "What kind of talk?" "Nothing malicious," Carson assured him quickly. "Just questions. About custody, about whether there's family that should be notified. The territorial government's been cracking down on informal arrangements lately." Through the screen door, Samuel heard Thomas laugh at something Sarah said, and the sound was like balm to his soul. The boy had been so quiet those first days, speaking only when spoken to, flinching at sudden movements. But slowly, carefully, Samuel and Sarah had coaxed him back toward childhood. "Their mother's sister," Samuel said finally, "lives back in Illinois. But she's got 6 children of her own and a husband who drinks. Thomas told me she turned them away when they first ran." Carson pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "I've been authorized to make this official if you're willing. Temporary guardianship with option for permanent adoption after a 6-month period. Judge Morrison's idea. He says a man who'd take in 3 children without thought of compensation deserves the benefit of doubt." Samuel stared at the paper, his throat tight. "What about what the children want?" "Already asked Thomas yesterday when I stopped by the schoolhouse. Boy didn't hesitate. Said he wants to stay with you and Miss Sarah wants his sisters to stay too." Carson's expression softened. "Also said you've been teaching him to read the Bible and that you told him it's all right to be angry at his father while still praying for his soul." "That's wisdom, Mr. Webb." Samuel took the paper with unsteady hands. His own past seemed to press against his shoulders. The years of anger after Matthew's death, the bottle that had nearly claimed him, the long road back to faith and Sarah's forgiveness. He'd thought himself beyond redemption once, but God had other plans. "There's one more thing," Carson said quietly. "Found some papers in Henley's saddlebags. Seems he owed considerable money to some unsavory characters back east. They'd been looking for him. With him dead, that threat dies too. The children are truly free now." Samuel nodded, blinking against the sudden moisture in his eyes. Inside, he heard little Emma's delighted squeal as Sarah played peekaboo with her, and Mary's gentle voice correcting Thomas's pronunciation of a difficult word. "They've been through hell," Samuel said hoarsely. "Yes," Carson agreed. "But they're not there anymore." The deputy mounted his horse and touched the brim of his hat. "I'll need those papers filed within the week. And, Mr. Webb, what you've done here, it matters, more than you might know." Samuel stood in the yard long after Carson's figure disappeared down the trail, the guardianship papers rustling in the morning breeze. The sun climbed higher, warming his face and casting long shadows across the land he'd worked his entire adult life. When he finally turned toward the house, he found Thomas standing in the doorway, his young face serious but unafraid. "Is everything all right, Pa?" the boy asked. Pa Samuel's heart swelled at the word, and he smiled through his tears. "Yes, son, everything's going to be just fine." The morning sun cast long shadows across the meadow as Samuel stood at the edge of his property, watching the 3 children play by the creek. 2 weeks had passed since that night in the barn when everything had come to light, and the healing had begun in earnest. Emma's laughter carried on the wind as she chased butterflies through the tall grass, her face bright with the kind of joy Samuel had never seen from her before. Timothy sat on a fallen log, sketching the mountains in a journal Mrs. Henderson had brought from town, his shoulders no longer curved inward with fear. And little Sarah, sweet Sarah, was teaching a collection of barn cats to sit in a row, her voice patient and gentle as she offered them treats. "They look different," came a voice behind him. Samuel turned to see Sheriff Morrison approaching, his badge catching the morning light. The lawman had become a regular visitor, checking on the children's progress and updating Samuel on the legal proceedings. "They are different," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We all are." Morrison nodded toward the children. Doc says Sarah's nightmares are getting better, and Timothy's started talking about maybe becoming an artist someday. And Emma, Samuel added, watching the girl spin with her arms outstretched, she's starting to believe she deserves happiness. The sheriff was quiet for a moment, then pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Official word came through yesterday. Their uncle won't be hurting anyone ever again. Life sentence, no possibility of parole. Samuel felt the last knot of tension in his chest finally loosen. Good. Judge also fast-tracked your guardianship papers. You're officially their guardian now, Samuel, all legal and proper. Samuel accepted the documents with trembling hands. After Margaret's death, he'd never imagined his house would be filled with children's voices again. Never thought he'd have reason to hope for the future. These 3 broken souls had given him purpose he'd lost years ago. There's something else, Morrison continued. That reward money the territorial government offered for breaking up the trafficking ring? It's yours by rights. Substantial sum. Samuel shook his head. Give it to the children's home in Salt Lake City. They need it more than we do. Morrison smiled. Figured you'd say that. He paused, watching Emma teaching Sarah some elaborate game involving flower crowns. You know, when you first brought these kids to town, I thought you were making a mistake. 3 traumatized children, and you barely keeping your own head above water. I thought the same thing, Samuel admitted. But sometimes the mistakes we think we're making turn out to be exactly what we needed. Timothy looked up from his sketching and waved. Samuel waved back, marveling at how the boy's eyes now held curiosity instead of fear when he looked at the world around him. We've all got our demons, Samuel said quietly. Mine were about failing to protect the people I loved. I couldn't save Margaret from the fever, couldn't save our unborn child. But these 3, they gave me a chance to try again. And they got a chance to be children again, Morrison observed. Fair trade, I'd say. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma came running up the hill, her hair flying behind her like a golden banner. Samuel! Samuel! Sarah found baby rabbits by the creek. Can we keep them, please? Samuel knelt down as all 3 children gathered around him, their faces bright with excitement and hope. A year ago, he'd been a broken man living alone with his ghosts. Now he was surrounded by family, different than what he'd planned for, but family nonetheless. Well now, he said seriously, baby rabbits need their mama just like children do, but we can visit them every day and make sure they're safe. Emma's face fell slightly, but then she brightened. And we can draw pictures of them. Timothy can teach us how. Timothy blushed but nodded eagerly. I could show you about shading and perspective. And I can name them all, Sarah chimed in, clapping her hands. Samuel looked up to see Morrison smiling. The sheriff tipped his hat. I'll leave you folks to your rabbit watching. But Samuel, he paused at the edge of the meadow, you did good. Margaret would be proud. As Morrison rode away, Samuel gathered the children close. The mountains stood sentinel around their valley, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing in Sunday morning. He thought of Margaret, of the life they'd planned together, and felt no sadness, only gratitude for the unexpected path that had led him here. Come on, he said, standing and taking Sarah's small hand in his. Let's go meet those rabbits. Together, they walked toward the creek, toward whatever came next, no longer running from the past but embracing the future they were building together.